Hello lovelies. Today we're going to be taking a look into the wild world of comics and their adaptation into tabletop role-playing games. So stay tuned. Adaptation in role-playing games is a tricky beast, and this applies to comics as well as to films, TV series, all of the rest. It can be a bit of a minefield creatively as well as in terms of business and contracts and deadlines and anything else you dare to mention. I've been fairly lucky when I've worked on adaptations, and I either haven't had to worry about all of that, or I've been working with rather chill people with IPs that could use the boost, quite frankly. Now, I'm talking about comics here, but I am specifically going to exclude manga and anime because reasons. Largely because most anime and manga is already made with adaptations into other media in mind. So you don't just get the manga, you get the anime, the manga, the separate series, figurines, whatever else, right? So enough time spent on that because we're not going to be talking about it. If I say comic book RPGs, then you're probably immediately going to think of the Marvel and DC games. Depending on your age, you might well be thinking of Phase Rip for Marvel. That is like the big daddy of older superhero RPGs. To me, none of these adaptations have ever quite hit right. Part of that is the problem with superhero comics, in that there is such a huge and broad span of things. When you have rules for things, you kind of have to stick to them, and they have to make sense, and they have to fit together. In comics, you can come up with contrived story reasons for things not to work out. Like, you can have Batman fight Superman and not be drop-kicked into the sun in the first 0.1 femtoseconds of combat. Things like that, right? So superhero RPGs tend to have to be quite sort of generic RPGs, and the center for the scaling is not normal humans and guns and things like that. It's somewhere higher than that before you reach the far reaches of your Supermans or whatever. That's a problem specific to superhero RPGs and superhero adaptations and comics. But that doesn't mean it's true for all comics. There are more comics in heaven and earth than dreamt of in your philosophy, or whatever. But there are other adaptation problems when it comes to taking a comic book story and turning it into a role-playing game. Often there's a complete series, so you know how things end. The stories are focused on those particular characters, and everyone else is just a sort of bit part. So there isn't necessarily the space for you to get into adventures and scrapes with your own brand new characters and so on. The main story is so strong and so dominating that it kind of takes control of the whole thing. Another problem is that with ongoing series in comics, by the time you've put together and come out with a game, maybe things have changed completely. Maybe they've reimagined or rebooted the whole thing, and so what you have is yesterday's news and isn't necessarily compatible with the direction that the comics or the whatever has gone in that time. So you can't really be definitive in a lot of ways. And there's all the usual problems with adapting someone else's intellectual property, like they quite rightly want some form of control and input and say in whatever it is that you are putting together. As they should. Often the license is limited for a certain number of years, and by the time you finish developing the book, You might be towards the end of your licensing period and someone else might be in charge of the IP, and they may not want to honour old contracts or ideas of extension or whatever else it is that you've agreed upon. I think this is part of the reason why there have been so many superhero RPGs in particular tied to these product lines and intellectual property lines. It's because they're constantly reinventing themselves, constantly trying to find new ways and means of doing things and raising money in different directions that we're going in. And RPGs are small potatoes when you've got Marvel movies, even with the string of current failures. Right? It's not something that really draws anyone's attention or that they necessarily particularly care about. Increasingly, that's also true of the comics themselves, of course, but still. American comics, then, American superhero comics specifically, have been very well covered by TTRPGs, especially Marvel and DC, with many different versions of these games angled at replicating these stories for you to play at your table. Now, despite all the other issues, superhero RPGs in the Marvel and DC line, where they have shared universes for the comics and crossovers, and it's also chaotic, that actually works reasonably well for tabletop RPGs because these settings, Marvel and DC, their multiverses even, are so sprawling and incoherent and contradict themselves all the time, despite the best efforts of various people. That becomes a positive because it makes room for you to have your little superhero adventures, either in part of this wider world where you can go up against the great villains, Doctor Doom or whoever, or you can just have your own hived off universe, right? Earth 69 dude or something, where you have your adventures, and that's fine too. So there's a lot of issues that come with it, but there's a lot of options as well. I feel like that ground has been trod fairly well, but it is also worth mentioning that some British comic strips, mostly those from 2000 AD, in fact I think only those from 2000 AD, have had multiple adaptations too. British comics have a bit of an odd history, come to that. There are a handful of longer listing titles, mostly kiddie comics like the Beano and the Dandy, a lot of flash in the pan attempts to have a more sort of mature or proper version of a comic that will appeal to whatever nascent adult youth culture is going on at the time, or to people who take comics seriously as art in the wake of the British invasion of the US, you know, your Gaimans and your Moores and your Morrisons and all of them. We've had attempts like Crisis and Revolver and Blast and Clint and Deadline and doubtless others that I am forgetting. Toxic was a strong effort for creator-owned comics in the UK, but the only one with any real staying power has been 2000 AD and kiddie comics, as I said, like the like the Dandy and the Beano. Older comics do still continue. Star Blazer is one that became a role-playing game, but the other things that did stick it out for a very long time before finally fading away were the war comics, and you can still get Commando, I think, or at least you could until relatively recently. I'm old, my memory is going, but for a lot of time, yeah, World War II comics. You know, you wonder why the British remain so obsessed with World War II. It's because it's part of the national story, you know, the heroically holding the line against the Nazis. Let's just forget that whole Oswald Mosley thing before the war, and, you know, and the constant retelling of all the heroics of the British people during that, and the Blitz spirit and all of that. A lot of that was perpetuated and continued by the comics, even though you had more thoughtful adaptations like Charlie's War, which was about World War One. But still, war comics, that's been a lot of them. War hasn't really been something that has been tackled straight when it comes to role-playing games, at least not very much, or not very successfully. So I think we can kind of tiptoe past that. Weird War is more interesting, apparently. This is why I don't like Shadowrun. Right, we had Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk has had a revival, but Shadowrun always struck me as, well, this is just D&D tropes with cybernetic trappings, right? So why can't we just enjoy Cyberpunk as it is, without having to bring elves and dwarves and orcs and trolls and other magical bullshit into it? Apparently I'm in a minority there. Possibly not now, but at the time I was in a minority there. And equally, if we're looking back to World War II, why can't we play something straight? I know war is hell, horrific, nasty. That's kind of the point. But these stories about the wars, 1 and 2, the world wars, these engaged and held people's interest for decades and decades and decades after the war itself. I still can't turn on the local news without some memorial or other being talked about, or some art installation meant to reflect upon D-Day or whatever. And yet the space is remarkably unexploited, at least in some sort of straight fashion. You've got pulp and Weird War, sure, but no World War II. So maybe that is an area, or World War I, so maybe that is an area in which something might emerge at some point. But then the generations that remember these wars have passed or are passing, so maybe there won't be as much interest going forward into the future. 2000 AD, which I've already shown you several times, I won't again, do pay attention, has had multiple adaptations. More specifically, Judge Dredd in particular has had multiple adaptations. None of them have been hugely successful. There was Games Workshop's version of Judge Dredd, which played out somewhere between a board game and a role-playing game, but was very focused on sort of tactical combat and very judge-focused, which only makes sense when you think about it. We've also had Wine. We've had 2 versions of Judge Dredd from Mongoose, one using the D20 rules, one using the Traveller rules, but none of these have ever quite sat right for me or hit the right tone, nor have they had huge success. It's a little odd because Dredd is internationally popular. So of all of those 2000 AD properties, you would think that Judge Dredd would have a chance of doing particularly well. But of course it is focused on the judges, something some of these games have tried to move away from, but it's the judges that people are interested in. And playing a fascistic bully boy, responding to crimes and dispensing summary justice up to and including execution, maybe doesn't necessarily appeal to people. Dredd can be a hero, but he is also a man of contradictions and a style of law enforcement and a world that was made up to kind of take the piss out of America, which they either don't get or don't appreciate a lot of the time. I think something like Dredd really needs a bespoke system, but it needs something more complete than what Games Workshop did for it. Wine had an interesting idea of how to go about it. You had a sort of core Dredd book and then Worlds of 2000 AD, but the license got yanked along the way, and so all we really got, if I remember correctly, was Rogue Trooper, Strontium Dog, and Judge Dredd. Those are probably the strongest stories, and they would still probably be amongst the strongest stories for conversion into role-playing games, but it just hasn't happened. And Rebellion, the software company who currently owns 2000 AD, they seem to have taken all of this back on board, and they recently acquired Tunnels and Trolls. So is that what they're planning? I wonder, because I think that's even less of a good fit than D20 was, unless a lot of things are strongly changed about it. I guess we'll find out what their plans are into the future. There was also a Slain, or Slanye, game as well, wasn't there? I think one of those was a Traveller Rules version, and I believe there was a D20 version. But I look back at 2000 AD, I look at Dread, and definitely there is space for an RPG for Dread. Just not as big as I think a lot of people want it to be. Rogue Trooper certainly makes for a potential game, but it has some of the issues that I think exist within war-oriented games, in that it can be very mission-specific and it can be kind of depressing. And Rogue Trooper is the last of the genetic infantrymen. He is this genetically engineered, blue-skinned guy with a mohawk haircut, wandering around a blasted, destroyed, chemically poisonous environment, just kind of getting into scrapes and surviving. Initially, his big mission was to track down the traitor general who betrayed the genetic infantryman and deal with him. So how would you set a role-playing game in that universe? You could play non-genetic infantrymen, but then that's avoiding the main thing that interests people. You could play a new generation of genetic infantrymen, which would kind of move away from the point that he's the last one. Would you be retreading the same ground? The world of New Earth that it's based on is interesting. The long conflict between the Noughts and the Southers is interesting. It's a science fiction war comic. I wrote a D20 version, which I think ended up shoved out into Signs and Portents just before they wound it up at Mongoose. D20 wasn't a great fit, but I could certainly see how Rogue Trooper could make for a good game if you move beyond the bounds of the comic series to some extent. Strontium Dog has been turned into a game a couple of times. Strontium Dog is set in a post-nuclear future where mutants are the victims of prejudice. Unlike the X-Men, most of these mutants do not have superpowers. They have tumours, or they're physically distorted in some way. Sometimes in a useful fashion, sometimes not. The main character is Johnny Alpha. He's lucky in that he can mostly pass for human, except he's got blank eyes, and he can emit radiation from his eyes to see through things, and various other stuff. But most of them are called things like Midden Face McNulty, or the Torso from Newcastle, or Kid Knee. So you kind of get some kind of sense of that. It has that dark sense of humour that a lot of British fiction and comics in particular have. And again, it's something mission-based. You are bounty hunters, mutants, who are given very few options for life on Earth and in Britain in the time period that the game is set. And one of the few ways that you can make money and send it back to the mutant ghettos that you crawled out of is to take up bounty hunting, enforcing law across the galaxy, across various planets, hunting down criminals and dealing with them. Which again is a great hook, and there is plenty of space in Strontium Dog for you to play other mutants and even normal people who travel alongside them. There's time travel shenanigans, there's all sorts, and a whole bunch of very 1980s puns in a lot of the older books. But yeah, that's definitely been one. It's one they've tried, but it doesn't have the same global awareness that Dread does. Slain, yeah, it's meant to be pronounced Slanye, and Niama is actually Neve, isn't it? But Gaelic pronunciations never made any sense. That's quite a big one, largely due to the artists that have been variously involved on the Slain comic strip for some time. But again, there have been attempts at conversions of that to a TTRPG, and they haven't done as hugely well as they could have or should have. In all of these instances, you have decades upon decades of fantastic art that could be lifted and put into game books, scanned from the archives. But it just doesn't seem to be enough. And again, putting these things into generic systems doesn't necessarily work. There's a modern counterpart to Slain as well, called Finn, who apparently was another incarnation of Slain. If you go back to the Time Warrior storyline in Slain, that would also make for a fantastic game. It's a kind of eco-terroristic version of Mage, is how that would play out. Returning to superhero comics for a moment, 2000 AD had one of the best superhero comic strips ever written by Grant Morrison before he really took off, and that was Zenith, or Zenith if you're American, I suppose. Superheroes, Cthulhu mythos, the legacy of World War II, an early instance of a tech mogul being a supervillain, all of this kind of stuff, really well done, but unfortunately it kind of wrote itself into a corner and out of any real possibility of being ongoing. Except it has a multiverse in which there are other heroes, many of them incarnations of heroes from older, cheesier British comics, updated, Tri-Man, Oakman, all of these kind of things. Even Billy Whiz is in there, and that looks like a Speed reference, but it isn't. So there is scope there for a Zenith game, but it is very dark, very British. I'm not sure people would take up with it, and it hasn't been in print for a very long time. So, apart from in collected editions. So, on the one hand, that means it's finished and maybe you could get to it. On the other hand, it means creator rights and ownership and so on is a bit of a tangled web. And how do you continue the story would be the question. And how do you make it relevant commentary on the world that we live in today without being overbearing and propagandistic, which is a concern. Though in the original storyline, the Cult of the Black Sun brings back the twin of Masterman, who was a Nazi superhero. So you can see how a lot of these storylines would still be relevant. There's more neglected properties from 2000 AD that I think would make good RPGs. Nemesis the Warlock, which kind of crosses over and intertangles with ABC Warriors. The idea of playing groups of alien resistance fighters fighting back against an oppressive Dark Ages sort of human empire, the Termites, seems like a good thing to me. Warhammer 40,000 ripped off Nemesis the Warlock wholesale for a lot of its background and so on, that just took the humans' side. So that seems ripe to me for adaptation, but again, it's kind of over and done and hasn't been back in a long time and is probably entangled in creator rights disputes and so on as well. But that seems to me like it could tap into a lot of that 40k love and energy that is out there, but come at it from a very different angle. There's Savage and Invasion 1999, as it was originally, which was originally a very jingoistic, just sort of updated war comic, where Britain was invaded by the Volgs, the Volgans. This was at the height of the Cold War, of course. And the Russians are a threat again now, which is how we ended up getting a revival of Savage, which is just brilliant. Savage is the main character in it, and he is part of the British resistance to the Volg invaders. And so the updated version is much grittier. It's as if Guy Ritchie directed a sort of 1980s resistance movie, Wolverines, but with a lot more grit and heart, a lot of grubbiness. Like, it understands that revolutionary movements and resistance movements and terrorist cells are not necessarily pleasant places to be. And the technology is mostly like stuff that almost could be here now. It jumps the shark a little bit later on, but yeah, there's a lot there that is really good and could make a really great sort of techno thriller resistance sort of based game. I would like to see that. Scarlet Traces was originally independently published, and the first main comic sort of takes place after the invasion of the Martians from the War of the Worlds, and has mysterious murders with people with their blood sucked out turning up on the shores of the Thames. It has Britain as the main inheritor of the Martian technology, trying to learn how to use it to maintain the empire and all the rest, and is starting to look to the skies to invade Mars in revenge. But that idea, taking the great game that went on between the various great powers prior to World War One, and dialing it up a bit with a devastated Britain that now has access to powerful chemical weapons in the form of the black smoke and heat rays and so on. Yeah, in a lot of ways, the War of the Worlds was a commentary on colonialism, and this kind of extends it and takes it back the other way slightly. But there could be a fantastic hard-edged steampunk game out of that would work. Indigo Prime is a very weird series, but if people have bought Invisible Sun and Mage and dealt with it, then surely they could deal with Indigo Prime, which follows initially the travails of this organisation, Indigo Prime, who travel throughout the multiverse, extracting payment for averting disasters, maintaining the integrity of the multiverse, and so on. Like in one of the original comics, they operate in pairs. So I think there's Basalt and Foundation turn up, offering to solve the problem of it may have been an alien invasion, in exchange for a bag of breadsticks and Lake Ontario, or something like that. But they can do things like manipulate time and space and have access to certain psychic powers and so on. The lore got nailed down a bit later on. Very weird, very strange. Great inspiration for all those other games. Could possibly work as its own game, but it may be too weird. But then if you made it a boutique experience, like Invisible Sun and so on, that might work. Nikolai Dante is another series. In this world, Russia's oligarchs and crime families ended up becoming noble houses under a czar, and basically took over the whole world. It is to a sort of Baroque science fiction future, sort of Russo-futurism or Slavo-futurism, in the same way you see things like Afro-futurism. But again, the trouble is the story's kind of done, and there isn't a lot of space for your characters and so on to do anything, but the world itself is interesting. There's been other comics with other strips over time. Accident Man from Toxic was made into a couple of movies, I believe. That's sort of slightly under the radar, outside of British comics, but with British sensibilities. The Authority had a Tristat system book, which is a bit of a miss. Warren Ellis's Transmetropolitan would be a good one to do, kind of post-cyberpunk journalism-oriented game. I mean, you could just play cyberpunk, dial the weirdness up a little bit, and make it a media-focused campaign, and that could work. But I think Transmet kind of deserves its own thing. Back to 2000 AD for Flesh, time travelers from the future, suffering under a food crisis, send harvesters and so on back in time, back to the age of the dinosaurs to harvest them for meat, which may or may not have led to the extinction of the dinosaurs, rather than the comet. Yeah, but, you know, cowboys and dinosaurs, with some time travel elements and some futuristic elements. That sounds good to me. Back to Grant Morrison, The Invisibles, a little terroristic cell of magicians and weird people trying to overcome the status quo and the invisible powers that be. Alan Moore would never allow it, but the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen has plenty of room for literary heroes. And sort of steampunk shenanigans, and later and earlier. Back to Ellis, Global Frequency was a huge inspiration for my book Activate, which you should buy and play. In that, there is this sort of ad hoc agency held together by an ex-CIA operative who have these phones that were smartphones before smartphones were really smartphones, that they can be called on at some time to respond to weird issues like leftover weird science from the Cold War, or serious threats of various kinds. It's kind of a bit like Fringe in some ways. There was a pilot for a TV series which you can find online if you hunt around, but I always thought that would have made a great game, which is why I made a game heavily inspired by it. Oh, well, let's end by going back to superheroes, because there is a vein of superhero fiction that is primarily down to people from the British Isles, I would say, that has been popular, is popular, but hasn't really been plumbed in TTRPGs, and that is the whole anti-hero stance. Now, I don't mean anti-hero in the normal sense, I mean anti-hero, where superheroes are brought low. In some ways, it is a played out trope at this point, but The Boys was and is pretty popular. Martial Law back in the day was pretty popular. New Statesman in Crisis, the abortive, mature comic here in the UK, that had a sort of darker slant on things, as did its companion piece, Third World War, which would also be a good basis for a game, come to that. And then there's things that aren't necessarily anti, but which sort of use comics as a way to examine the history of comics as if that history were true, such as Planetary, again, a Warren Ellis game. But something like that would probably work well as well. Something that's neither positive nor negative, but in which you can explore stories from the rich history of comics or role-playing games, come to that, as if they were real events. So maybe you have to penetrate a bubble of altered reality where the original creator of role-playing games is locked in his own fantasy due to some kind of, I don't know, radioactive mushrooms or something, and you use things as allegories for the various aspects of the early history of TSR or whatever. You could do all of these things. Ultimately, what I think the problem comes down to is the usual problem with adaptations. The story's told, there's not enough room, rights issues, contractual issues. You're never going to make enough money to satisfy the IP holder, who will make far more from TV or film or computer games or anything other than our weird little hobby. But there is nothing to stop you being influenced by these things, wearing your heart on your sleeve, and doing kind of off-label versions of all of these kind of things. And that may also free you from concerns about system and so on that tends to lead the people who buy up IPs and churn out games for them to use the same generic system over and over again. But that's what I think. That's a too long overview of what I think. What do you think? Leave a comment to boost my engagement, and I may actually be interested in it. Zang. Hello lovelies, I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff. Please like, subscribe, and most important of all, share, so that people can discover me and all the wonders that I offer.